Thank you. I really appreciate the enthusiasm that we always find here in Melbourne. And I have to say, Melbourne is one of the cities where you have one of the largest concentration of independent inventors and creative thinkers and powerful and dynamic people. And I want to thank some of them right now. One of them is Ian, sitting right back there. Ian is quite a hero. He's one of the main reasons we're here. Ian and Serge are heroes, and we're working on a... Thank you, Ian and Serge, indeed. We're working on a hydrolysis project here to demonstrate the principles we're talking about, that indeed if you understand fractality, it is key to an energy technology, and that's actually the reason we're here in Melbourne, because there's so many wonderful creative inventors and powerful people here. Oh, well, we just did Subway, so... But I'm feeling good, it's all fine. So, my name is Dan Winter. The websites are goldenmean.info, fractalfield.com, theimploder.com, breakthroughtechnologies.com, so there's lots of resources here. We do have one of the world's largest private websites, goldenmean.info. We have 2 million hits a month, typically. We do have a global network. I've been at this, too long to tell, 20, 30 years, oh my God. But tonight's focus is, we're going to start with what is essentially a review of what we did at the last lecture in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, which is introduction to the science in very basic terms. What is a fractal? How do you visualize that? And how does that tell you the origin of all centripetal forces? So we'll start simple, review the science, and then we're going to explain how literally that is an invitation to understand why gravity exists, why life force exists, why perception exists. Why human bliss and enlightenment exist. If you understand one simple geometry, and I repeat, one simple geometry, what is that one simple geometry? The golden ratio and how it nests in 3 dimensions, the stellation of the dodeca. That simple geometry, and we have somebody who's very expert at building these golden ratio structures here. Thank you, Ken. And Ken, take a bow here. He brought all the models. If you nest 5 tetra, you have icosa dodeca, 5 cube, dodeca, 5 octa, dodeca. So anytime you nutate tetra octa cube at that critical 32-degree tilt, you create the dodeca icosa symmetry set. So there's basically only 2 symmetries in the universe. One is tetra octa cube, which 7 axes of spin. This is the stellation of the tetra to cube octa. And you can collapse it to the tetra, but that essential symmetry set has 7 arrows, 7 axes of spin symmetry. Tetra, octa, and cube octa. So that symmetry is all the same in terms of a wave function, how waves behave. 7 arrows pass through that, and that's the origin of human heart muscle, Hebrew, and the braiding algorithm of DNA. It's all based on 7 arrows. However, the opposite of that is that icosa, that jitterbug, when you go from there to there, which is the origin of superconductivity in gold and DNA. And when you do that jitterbug, you create a golden ratio path through center, which is the reason superconductivity works, and DNA and all kinds of other good stuff. You have another symmetry set, which is a 5-based symmetry array, and that's how the cube is embedded in the dodecahedron. So you might, if you're close here, you can see the blue cube inside with the 2 green tetrahedron embedded in the cube, and then the cube is tilted at 32 degrees into the dodeca structure. The point I'm making is simply from a wave viewpoint, and waves are all we have to talk about if we happen to be physicists, and from the point of view of waves of charge, or the unified field, or the compressible medium, or the quantum foam, whatever you want to call it, the ether. From the point of view of those waves, only 2 essential symmetries exist. Tetra octa cube, the center with 7 arrows, and in that structure the waves create destructive interference called the octave, and isolate charge, which is why the hex is used to store and not to distribute. Whereas if you tilt that structure, tetra octa cube, into dodeca icosa, then you create the pent golden ratio structure, which creates maximum constructive wave interference, and therefore charge distribution, which is the nature of life and mind and the sacred and God and the collective unconscious and fractals and phase conjugate dielectrics and all the good stuff. So that basic relationship is the symmetry that we're going to talk about tonight. That if you take that, the only way waves can actually gather and compress constructively, I think we'll start with this one.
Carefully aligns the...
This is an animation of this structure in 3D. So we're talking about the same structure. I've stellated the dodeca, ecosa, dodeca, ecosa, dodeca, ecosa in 3D, which is the only really possible three-dimensional fractal. I'm going to slow this animation down, something you can do in Keynote and not in PowerPoint, hopefully. So here, see how there could be an infinite number of, right here, there could be an infinite number of dodeca, ecosa, right here in the bottom right. An infinite number of these dodeca, ecosa, right there. So that is the geometry. That is the only geometry we are going to be discussing tonight, right there. Do you see what that is? Dodeca, ecosa, forever. That is the only shape that we're going to discuss this evening. No other. And we are going to explain that that shape, do you see the two pine cones kissing right there? See the two pine? It's how romantic. Two pine cones are kissing noses, aren't they? Well, that's called phase conjugation. And in physics, that has been observed to create self-organization. In optics, actually, in lasers. And the truth is that that geometry creates a pattern among those waves of electric charge which causes a suction to exist at center. Call it implosion, which is called centripetal force. And that precise exact symmetry, which I've written a new equation for to prove that that is the reason that hydrogen exists, right there. That also is the reason perception exists. It's the reason color exists. It is the reason gravity exists. It is the reason life force exists. And it is the way you create compression when you focus your attention. Did you know that when you focus your attention, you create an electric field that causes charge to compress? It's very measurable. Bill Tiller's very famous physicist. It's absolutely clear that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. Focused human attention also reduces radioactivity measurably. In other words, focused human attention is an electric field that is centripetal. And this right there is why. That's the shape of the wave that you make. If you visualize what's happening between the hemispheres of your brain when you have a bliss experience, that's what's happening. It's called phase conjugation. It's implosive. It creates centripetal force. Well, that's the discussion we want to have. That if you understand only that one symmetry, only that, no other shape needs to be discussed. But if you understand that, called phase conjugation, two pine cones kissing, then you understand the cause, origin, and mechanism of, like the reason an object falls to the ground, gravity. You understand how life force happens. You understand how pine cones and chicken eggs make voltage from gravity. All that by simply understanding how pine cones kiss. And thanks to Ian, who is incredibly dedicated, we happen to have the pine cones right here. I don't know how are they going to kiss. We'll have to get work on that. Yeah, more romance here. So, Valerie said I need to make this story personal. No advanced science. She says the words have to be simple, and this has to be a very personal story. So, I'm going to tell you a personal story. I was studying the golden mean ratio, actually. That's what I was studying when I was a kid, actually. I was building models like this 30 years ago. In fact, I started distributing that kit. And so Valerie said, tell them how you got interested in this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you how I got interested in this. First, you need to understand why the golden mean ratio was so interesting to me. Remember, you never study geometry just to study the numbers. No. You actually only study geometry for one reason only, and that is to learn what waves are going to do. truly. Otherwise, you get in this profound confusion called numerology, and you don't understand the difference to physics. Pattern recognition is valuable, but only if it predicts what waves are going to do. So, this is a beautiful sequence. It's just, in fact, it is our definition of beauty in most disciplines. The definition of beauty in most disciplines, called golden mean ratio, is a particular progression. But I'm going to explain to you why it's beautiful because of what it predicts about waves. So here's the golden mean ratio, 0.618, 1, 1.618, 2.618. So in this sequence of numbers, which is infinite, you could add any two and get the next number forever. Or you could take this number, 1.618, and multiply it by any number and get the following number. So 0.618 times 1.618 is 1.0, or 1.618 squared is 2.618. It's kind of cool. However, why is that more than just beauty? Why is it the solution to Einstein's dilemma? I'll tell you why. What physics failed to discover, and this is actually almost catastrophic to our culture. In fact, our culture may cease to exist specifically because physics has been so stupid about one simple measurable fact, that if you cause a very large number of waves to interfere, if you cause those waves to interfere in octave relationship, powers of 2, you create the total output power, you create maximum destructive wave interference, which is why when you play octaves in your headphones, in your music, you actually create dissociation in brain waves, separateness between the hemispheres. Because octaves is the maximum way waves can hurt each other, actually. It's the maximum destructive wave interference possible is called the octave. All of Western music based on the octave. Do you think we have a problem? Yes. Do we need to do something about it? Yes. How are we going to fix this? Let's discuss it later. The opposite of that is if you cause a very large number of waves to interfere that are golden ratio in frequency, the output power is maximum. So the solution to maximum constructive wave interference is the golden mean ratio. It's a simple software that anybody can write, nonlinear interference. Golden mean ratio is the generalized solution to constructive wave interference. You'd think that would be trivial, wouldn't you? But modern physics does not know. That, to me, is almost as shocking as knowing that your physics teacher doesn't know why an object falls to the ground. It's shocking. It's just shocking. It's so horrible that physics didn't know. Because obviously, if Einstein had known, in fact, Einstein stated the problem. Infinite constructive wave interference is my problem, and that's why I don't know what the unified field is. That's Einstein's words. Really. And this is the literal, precise solution. Recently, Nassim Haramein confirmed this when he discovered the golden mean ratio is the solution to black holes and gravity, all this good stuff. But I actually presented at a physics conference before he did, but it's okay. Nassim's a great guy. Anyway, so this is golden mean ratio geometry here. And this is constructive wave interference. And this is octaves. And this is destructive wave interference. Octaves, tetraocta cube. Golden ratio is dodecaecosa. The two categories of symmetry that we just discussed. Okay, so you can see why I was studying golden mean ratio, because it's the solution to compression. Infinite constructive compression is the name for the unified field solution. Now, of course, no one told Einstein what a fractal is, and every physicist can tell you today that the only infinite compression we have is fractal. Any software engineer could tell you that as well. But sadly, all these brilliant people around never even asked the question, what does a 3D fractal look like for waves? Hint, hint, hint. And, oh, let's write an equation for the radii of hydrogen. That's what I wrote. It's very simple, actually, but it works. So anywho, going back to Valerie, my partner, who said, now you got to make this personal and fun. And so how did you get interested? So I had been studying the golden mean ratio, and my buddy, Dr. Korotkov, here, Here's Dr. K from St. Petersburg. He's a hero. I like him. We have a lot of fun together. And he discovered, he was sent to St. Petersburg, and there's this group of kids called World Without Blindness Project in Russia who are being taught to see without their eyes. And it turns out that a large group of kids are able to see without. You can tune into dozens of television programs in Russia and you see these kids. They're seeing without their eyes all the time. Well, it's cool. So Dr. Korotkov was hired, contracted to measure how are they doing this. So sure enough, he got out his gizmos and he measured the population of kids in Russia who could see without their eyes. He says, oh, people who can see without their eyes, the primary way you identify a person who's able to see without their eyes is you measure their brain waves, you check the harmonics of their brain waves, and if their brain waves are in golden mean ratio, that's the primary way you can find out if they're seeing without their eyes. When I heard Korotkov measured this, I fell off my chair. It made my day, made my week, made my year. It was so cool. So I says, hey, we're on to something here. Anyway, there's other things you measure, but this was the primary indicator of the ability to have peak perception. Now later, I wrote software to teach people how to have golden ratio in their brainwaves called the Bliss Tuner. And the largest bank in Australia, ANZ Bank here in Melbourne, is using my system. They purchased it. When you sell it to bank managers, you call it peak perception, by the way. Same thing, the Bliss Tuner, but you don't have to, you know, it's a language issue. But peak perception actually is this ability to use golden ratio. So what does it look like? And there's a long history of using golden ratio to identify. Golden ratio is called transcendence in brain waves, and I have a whole lecture on the history of the neuroscience of this. And the mind mirror people, they had the right picture for transcendence, enlightenment, ecstasy in the brainwave alpha beta frequency mapping, and they just missed the fact that it was golden ratio from here to here. Tisk, tisk, they missed it. Oh well, but the concept was there. Anyway, there's a whole history of this. But when you actually measure it, what it looks like is here. This is someone having a bliss experience. Right? And what happens is your spine liquid pumps in phase, and we know all about the physics of Kundalini, and I spent a lifetime teaching this. And sure enough, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in golden mean ratio, golden mean, golden mean, golden mean, in your EEG, cross-hemispheric brainwave power spectra. This is my invention, my technology. It's called the Bliss Tuner, da-da-da. So what's happening to the electric field around your body when you're having enlightenment? Is it complicated? No. It's simple. This is the electric field around your body during human bliss. This is why we have bumper stickers that say, get fractal or get dead, because in fact, that's what you have to do. You have to get centripetal, and that defines life. I actually brought the book along with me tonight. I didn't have this the other day. The book is called Healing is Voltage by my friend Dr. Jerry Tennant, MD. You scan over the body, and wherever the body is electronegative, it's healthy. Wherever the body is electropositive, you got disease. Pretty simple, right? Healing is voltage. So what is electronegativity? Hint, if you ask any physicist what an electron is, he'll tell you it's a fractal black hole. So electronegativity is fractal, it's centripetal. So the ability to be alive depends on the ability to suck in charge. Or, to put it very simply, it really sucks. You get the flavor that this ability to create centripetal force is the secret of life. And that interested me. So that's why I started writing this software. Actually, I have to backtrack a little bit. ANZ Bank here in Melbourne ordered my system to teach their bank managers how to have empathy for other cultures. And the same technology, the Heart Tuner, Bliss Tuner, it takes a power spectrum of two people's EKG and displays the harmonics and then displays the musical fundamental of two persons' hearts and teaches them to line up their hearts so they come into phase lock. And when two people's hearts enter the same musical fundamental, you have the physics of empathy. So this is called empathy training or corporate consensus process or peacemaking. Actually, and it's also used by one of the largest Tantra schools in Los Angeles. Because the physics of Tantra is actually the fusion of living plasma between two people, which is made possible when phase lock. Just like, the grandfather clocks in the room have to... Well, when your hearts link up, you have the physics for the biologic entrainment that actually allows your aura to merge with another person's aura, which is an introduction to Tantra, the fusion of plasma. And actually, tonight's lecture is going to end, the second half of tonight's song and dance is actually about how you do that in groups. And it's called The Physics and the Psychology of Alchemy. So that's where we're going later in the lecture tonight. But in the beginning, in this introduction, I just wanted to show you how I got interested in this concept of why golden ratio solved problems that physics has been puzzled with for years. I mean, has physics known the electrical nature of life? No. Now we do, actually. We truly do. We know, for example, how it is that a pine cone actually makes voltage from gravity, or a chicken egg. It's a very basic and fundamental question. But here we are, we're in a lab here in Melbourne, and we're putzing around with high frequencies, trying to get implosive collapse happening for hydrogen, which means there would be energy in that collapse of charge, and therefore a solution to our energy crisis. Well, cool. But what is it that makes that collapse of charge have energy? And I suggest to you that if you knew why there is a voltage you can measure from here to here on a pine cone, or there's a voltage you can measure from there to there on a chicken egg. In the case of the chicken egg, it's about 4 to 12 millivolts. If your voltmeter is high impedance, you can measure that voltage. And if your biology teacher doesn't know where that voltage comes from, they really should not get a paycheck, honestly, because they don't know what life is. It's true. The source of that voltage from here to here, just like the voltage from here to here in the pine cone, comes about because there is an electrical difference in pressure from here to here. And that electrical difference in pressure is a difference in fractality. So this is basically what would be called a fractal capacitor. What do I mean when I say fractal? When I say fractal, imagine fern, onion, pine cone, rose. You got it? The inside looks like the outside, right? That's it. That's all I mean when I say fractal. It's a profound but simple concept where the inside looks like the outside. Oh, you pick your lover because she's fractal. Right, the inside looks like the outside. You get how beautiful that is? Very attractive. Yes, true. Okay. So, the fractality of the arrangement of these seeds on the pine cone creates a voltage from gravity called life. That's the new information. That's the profound idea here, that this geometry creates a centripetal force essential to life. So every living protein, including DNA, has a simple top-down view like this. The 10 spirals of the golden mean. Remember the two pine cones kissing? The top-down view looks like this. So every protein that's alive, including your DNA, and now we know that this is also literally the equation for hydrogen's radii is right here as well. And that's the actual basis of our research project here in Melbourne. So why? What is it about that rose-like fractal geometry, which is the solution to compression, where the inside looks like the outside, that allows that to get voltage from gravity? to actually gain inertia from implosive collapse. That's the issue. Ride the long wave, Uncle Joe. Where was that long wave in Surfers of the Zavuya by Jose Argoyas? Do you know? The long wave goes into the short wave. Actually, the long wave goes into the center. And if you ride that wave moving in toward implosion, even in the Tai Chi, if you make that motion correctly, you trace a golden spiral with your fingertip. And if you did the Tai Chi correctly, you felt a tingle of capacitance in the tip of your finger, specifically because you made that arc angle of charge collapse where you gained inertia from the geometry of the collapsing wave. So during that process of collapse, you're gaining power. And we need to understand why. I'm going to give you another simple example, and then I'm going to show you how the geometry does it. The simple example is, of course, Schauberger's work on implosion. Let's see, I was at slide number 97. I'm now going to go down to the example from Victor Schauberger. We have the hero of the Schauberger work here, if I may say, Martin Selecki, who's filming. Martin made all the films, or a lot of them, on Victor Schauberger's famous work on implosion, working with Callum Coates, who wrote all the books about Schauberger's work on implosion, and Martin himself has done many of the experiments. He's joined us today from Byron. We're honored that you're here. Thank you for being here, Martin, and filming. It's a cool thing. And so Martin is something of an expert on these things. Please ask him afterwards. It's a fine thing. So here is one of the experiments that those groups, one of the kinds of experiments that those groups who do the famous work on implosion, here it is. You've got about 50,000 RPM here. Here's the water. The water is very pure, but it's piezoelectrically doped, very much like how we're doing hydrolysis, okay? So this water being piezoelectric means the pressure, mechanical stricture, becomes voltage. Very simple. So, and the doping just means that you have a trace amount of a substance in the water that affects the conductivity, like the electrolyte in hydrolysis. So the water is now a capacitor. It's going to 50,000 RPM. Now, in Implosion Research Center in Plymouth in UK, Jonathan and Dolly, where they make the implosion products, the inside of this cavity is silver. We now know that it'd probably be better even gold, palladium, and platinum, because those are the actual phase conjugating dielectrics, which we will talk more about later. But they make an implosive capacitor. Anyway, once it gets going at 50,000 RPM, you actually, what you see is the air around the thing starts turning blue, and it makes an electric field that's implosive, which is actually the key to the Joe cell. And then the pollution in the surrounding area begins to be sorted. Many things happen. One of the many things that does happen is that it spontaneously starts getting colder, also like the Joe cell. And the voltage difference appears here to here. And that voltage difference means this is a generator which is making power wattage from gravity. And the power does come from gravity. And it works so well that Hitler wrote the check to Mr. Schauberger for inventing it. It was functional as a generator. Now, you need to know why this starts getting colder and why it makes voltage from gravity. Why is there a voltage difference from here to here? And if you're good, you will know the polarity of that voltage difference. That's called implosion. And that is the reason life happens. Every leaf of every tree, every pine cone, everything that's self-respecting enough to call itself life has learned how to get that voltage from gravity. And everything alive does that by being fractal and using golden ratio. So all your biology teachers for, how many centuries have told you everything alive uses golden ratio, haven't they? But you know what they forgot to tell you? Was why. There is an electrical reason. The electrical reason is that's how you get voltage from gravity. Actually, it's life. And we're going to explain a little bit more about gravity, what gravity is. Gravity is the implosive collapse of charge, obviously. So what I promised to do was to show you how that works, why that works, and to do that because the central issue of this evening, the central issue of the first half of this evening's conversation, right here in our opening slide, is to suggest to you that that single geometry is the cause of gravity and life and perception and bliss and color and alphabets, right? So in order to understand how that geometry of waves creates gravity and life and perception and alphabets, you need to understand how and why that geometry makes a force which is centripetal. So you really need to know for yourself why that geometry makes the electric field centripetal. Because if you do, you'll know why life exists and why gravity exists. And further, you will know why you need to go home urgently and make a magnetic map of your bed and your house and your garden. And they all need to look like a rose. So it's very important that you understand for yourself how centripetal forces are generated. When you know, for example, they did the Agnihotra, and do you know the people who did the Agnihotra did not die in the Bhopal chemical disaster? The Agnihotra is a phase conjugate field that created a centripetal force, and those are the survivors. Little hint, when the tornadoes come, and when the solar wind comes, and when the rapture comes, and when the compression comes, and when the death comes, compress or die. Right? So, if you understand the principle, you are then empowered. So here is the principle. And then you can see how everything flows from there, including the answer to that very simple question, why does an object fall to the ground? Because you need to know, even though Einstein didn't. So, this is the only geometry we're talking about this evening. We're only talking about one. So nobody here can say tonight's lecture was complicated. I won't permit it. Because I only talked about one thing. I spoke about nothing else this evening. Only that picture. That is the only picture I have discussed tonight and the only picture I will discuss tonight. So please do not go home and say that you listened to a complicated lecture tonight. I won't have it. No, it's simple. Okay, so in this geometry, I've got 10 golden mean spirals approaching center, which just happens to be the top-down view of DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, every living protein, and hydrogen. Okay? In that picture, when the waves approach each other, the reason that this is the solution to compression and the solution to constructive wave interference is that when wavelength A meets wavelength B, they said, oh, let's have babies. Let's have conjugal relations. Let's conjugate. And they have kids. And the kids add and multiply recursively the wavelength and the velocity. The name for recursive adding and multiplying is conjugation. Do you get it? Oh, let's have conjugal relations. Let's see if our DNA can add and multiply. Do you see what the principle? And in physics, phase conjugation, and this is a picture of what lasers are doing when they conjugate, is the first time we ever discovered self-organization. And time reversal, by the way. So, when the waves are meeting in this way, they're adding and multiplying the interference. And when waves interfere, they recursively add and multiply, and only golden ratio solves the problem of adding and multiplying so that everybody fits the nest. We just showed you, right? You could add any two numbers and get the next one, or you could multiply. Well, the golden ratio is the only proportion in the universe that adds and multiplies. That's why it's the solution to constructive interference and the solution to Einstein's nightmare, infinite constructive compression. So, and it's why that's the physics of black holes, as Nassim Haramein has recently demonstrated.
But doesn't any frequency add and multiply?
No, if you add and multiply a large number of waves, then they need to add and multiply their wavelength and their velocity. And any other ratio, like for example 2, would create destructive interference. You add and multiply 2 plus 2 plus 4 and 8, and then the 8 and the 16 interfere with the 2 and the 4, and that's destructive. Whereas golden ratio allows this pattern to be constructive. This is the only possible geometry of constructive interference. Another way of saying that is, this is the only geometry that can allow an infinite number of waves to meet.
If you have two waves that are the same, so
let's say you have wavelength 1 and wavelength 2. They interfere and make wavelength 3. Now wavelength 3 has to interfere with 2 and makes 5, and they interfere, and that's destructive to destructive to destructive.
Yeah, but if they're the same, it doesn't matter if they're golden ratio or not, they'll still be constructive.
But if wavelength 1 and wavelength 1 interfere, and then they make wavelength 2, that's an octave, and that's destructive interference to start with.
Why is it destructive?
You can do the software we just modeled. Octaves are the most destructive wave possible for waves to interfere.
But you're just assuming that.
No, that's an elaborate software emulation that proved it. The octave is the most destructive possible way for waves to interfere. Yeah, well, that's the output of the software algorithm. But we could go back there, but I want to finish this thought. Very few people are aware of that. But it's goldenmean.info/matrix, and we actually present the software to do that emulation as well. So very few people are aware of that, but it's a fact. I state it as a fact because we investigated and did the software emulations, and it's a fact, in my view, that's incontrovertible, that the most destructive possible wave interference by ratio is octave, powers of 2, and the most constructive ratio is golden mean, for sure.
If you have one golden ratio multiplied by another, isn't that a power of 2?
No. No. 0.618 times 1, or 1.618, is a power of golden ratio, not a power of 2.
But if it's a wave that's a certain wave, and you multiply it by 2...
you multiply 1.618 times 1.618.
Right.
That's not 2. That's squared. Yeah. Let's finish this thought.
Okay.
So the square relationship, powers of 2 is destructive interference. It's not evil, it's just simply charge isolating. It's very good for a hexagram to store honey, but it's very bad for your house to be built all of powers of 2. It's good for secrets, bad for distribution. And life is based on distribution, not secrets. That's God's message to you when you die, If you had too many secrets, you don't die well. Very simple physics. You're not a shareable wave. It's actually plasma physics. But we want to go to the core of the issue here at the moment, which is why this makes centripetal force. So these waves are adding and multiplying recursively, constructively, not just their wavelength, but their wave velocities. So when the wave speeds, the wave fronts add and multiply, that turns compression into acceleration. And that is the cause of gravity.
Einstein didn't like the idea of infinite velocity.
Actually, Einstein thought that the speed of light was a speed limit, and he was very, 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 very wrong. That's right. Because he didn't see where the plasma went through the center point, which is the Planck length, which it goes through the Planck length center, in the case of hydrogen, by speeds which are golden ratio multiples times the speed of light, actually. And that's what my theory of gravity requires, is that we will be measuring velocities faster than the speed of light, which are golden mean ratio multiples times the speed of light. And Professor Raymond Chow has already made a measurement of 4.23 times c, the speed of light, which is golden mean cubed, actually. So we believe there's lots of evidence that the speed of light is not a speed limit. However, it is a threshold condition requiring golden ratio to get through. Be more accurate. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. The point here is simple. We would like you to know, why does this create suction? Gravity is the suction for charge. What Einstein said, that one of the things he did right, was he said that gravity was not able to be distinguished from acceleration. He was right about that. And what is accelerating? I call it charge. You could call it ether or the quantum foam. You have waves in a compressible medium. Call it the ether, the quantum foam, the time-space continuum. I call it charge. Plus and minus charge is just the compression versus the rarefaction of the quantum foam, the compressible media of which everything is made. Yes, sir?
Where does magnetism fit into all this electricity and such?
We can have that conversation, but just to try to put it very briefly, that all charge fields, and therefore all waves, actually self-organize into toroidal shapes. And on the surface of that toroid, if you measure the flow of that charge this way, you call it magnetism. If you measure the same flow of that same charge this way, you call it voltage. You see? So voltage is called pressure, amperage is called flow, vice versa. But magnetism and electric fields are the same stuff. They're made of charge. And when you measure the vector this way versus this way, you call one voltage and one you call the other magnetism. That's why some people say, well, that was electric and this is magnetic and that's separate. That's just a schizophrenia, actually. That's childish. It's a unified field, and the relationship between electricity and magnetism is perpendicular just because of the way you happen to measure it.
So one doesn't exist without the other.
Precisely. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Thank you, sir. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. So, back to our point. We're saying that you need to know why does this create suction or centripetal force at the center. So, remember we said the waves are adding and multiplying their phase velocity. Here's a simple example. The surfer's riding here, and the main wave is going this way, and there's a curl coming down the side of the wave this way, and there's a tube right here. The surfer gets in the tube, and then the waves collapse, and the surfer is shot like a gun, right? That's the adding and multiplying of the phase velocities, okay? It's just a way of thinking about it. But in fact, it's true. We have actually measured heterodyning in golden ratio, in megahertz, in our little lab, haven't we? It's really cool. So the point is, when the waves add and multiply by golden ratio, they constructively, repeatedly add and multiply the wave speed as well. That's what Einstein missed. If he'd have known it, he'd have got it. Very simple. But because physics doesn't realize that, they do not know why an object falls to the ground. But now you know. That's the reason gravity happens. That's the reason gravity exists. Another way of saying that is that atoms only have gravity to the extent the nucleus is fractal or golden ratio to the electrons. And my new equation is proof that that's specifically true of hydrogen. So visualize what's happening very simply. The waves are adding and multiplying the speed of the wave front velocity, called phase velocity. So out of this kind of compression, some of the charge, some of the electrical inertia is converted from compression into the acceleration of charge. The origin of the acceleration of charge. Remember, if you know what causes acceleration of charge, you know what causes gravity. Because Einstein did get that right. Acceleration is the same as gravity. So this is the origin of acceleration, because some of that compression, adding and multiplying recursively, the speed of the wave front, and if they met in a cube, the waves couldn't add and multiply recursively. They'd start destructively interference, and the phase velocities wouldn't keep constructively adding and multiplying, and gravity would not exist. Okay, this is why golden ratio specifies the radii of hydrogen, and my new equation was proof that that extends right down to the level of Planck in the center of hydrogen. So this is a way, when pine cones meet this way, imagine two vortex are meeting and the pine cones are crossing in the center. They're getting screwed, so to speak. It's otherwise known as embedding in physics. That process of two pine cones meeting from opposite directions, if you're into physics, phase conjugate optics is nice to imagine here, where the two lasers are meeting, coming in opposite directions, and they begin to implode, they make centripetal force, and they create self-organization. And actually, they call it time reversal, but it just means that the waves that go faster than the speed of light go backward in time. And so that geometry of pine cones meeting like that, pine cones kissing, creates a suction for charge at center, because the phase velocities are now being pushed through the Planck length at center. So that is essentially the way in which all centripetal forces are generated. Now, we're not going to go into the detailed physics this evening, but my little equation, then I took that idea, and I took the well-known work by Hayrovska, who had shown that the radii of hydrogen were golden ratio all over the place. And I extended his work with my own new equation and showed that if you multiplied Planck length times golden ratio precisely in a whole number power, you got exactly the radii of hydrogen. That was exciting. It's like, oh, hydrogen? Oh, we just built the model. I built the model for what is hydrogen 30 years ago, but I didn't know it was a model of hydrogen at the time. Did you know that the x, y, and z value of every vertex in here, dodeca, ecosa, dodeca, ecosa, dodeca, ecosa, dodeca, the x, y, and z value of every vertex is a whole number multiple of golden ratio, infinitely. The distance to center is golden ratio, like hydrogen. That's the reason phase conjugation exists, the reason gravity exists, and the reason superconductivity exists, because you have zero resistance for passive charge through center. So, I present to you in relationship to this just very briefly, because we're not going to do a physics lecture tonight, but well, first of all, this is what the picture then looks like, to visualize another way. Remember, we're only discussing one picture this evening, and this is the same picture. Do you see how the golden ratio works? 0.6181, 1.618, 2.618. This is what's happening at the center. It's the same picture I've been showing you all night, just different visualizations of the same picture. So this is what Nassim did such great work on. He said if you took, and I really congratulate Nassim for this, if you take the frequency versus the radius of the universe, the big galactic plane, the local galaxy, the solar system, the atom, and Planck, or the Big Bang. So I'm taking simply the radius versus the frequency of everything important. And I'm plotting it. First of all, it all fits on a line. Ain't that cool? Radius versus frequency? Interesting, huh? Cool, right? So, but what he showed was, if you plot those, the universe, the galaxy, the solar system, the atom, and Planck, if you plot the frequency versus radius on one line, you get golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio. He noticed. And so he says that's the mechanism. Now, Nassim got one thing wrong. He says golden ratio is the result of gravity. He's wrong. It's the cause. But that's okay. We'll fight about that later. Essentially, we agree. So, lots of people are getting on board with this, which is sort of cool. And then we have Surfer Dude. In Australia, you have to talk about surfers. Martin, for example. And Surfer Dude, he made headlines for months because his unified field theory, which is based on this, it's called E8, which actually, if you look at it right, is a stellation of this. Anyway, he became famous because if you model this symmetry called E8, you get every single subatomic particle and everything that physics knows about all fits in one pattern, one symmetry. But what he forgot to mention was that in that E8 symmetry, and this is all the subatomic particles, every known particle of physics exists in that one symmetry. But what he forgot to mention was that E8 is entirely built on golden mean ratio. In fact, the guy behind it, Mohammed El-Nashi, he has 106 papers in the literature about golden mean ratio in physics. So the latest, hottest unified field theory, the headline-making latest unified field theory, called E8, is entirely based on golden ratio. So that's why the large-scale distribution of matter in space shows that a fractal pattern. In fact, the universe appears to be dodecahedral. And so other scientists like El-Nashi says fractalization is the origin of gravity, and Coxeter, I'm sorry, this is El-Nashi's work. He calls it golden mean quantum field theory. So it's sort of becoming a common thing for people to talk about fractality. Ah, yes. This is Andre Linde, the physicist. He suggests that the fractal nature of space may actually be the cause of gravity. I'm just pointing out to you that this is not such a revolutionary idea, that we can understand these centripetal forces. Okay, so we're nearing an end to our science class for the evening. Notice that this geometry that's possible in the center of that construction, it's called scale invariance, or global scaling, or non-destructive collapse. Notice that it really sucks. I'm sucking the air out of the dodecahedron, and it's changing scale without changing ratio. That's what you need to do in order to die well. If you want to take your memories with you, I tell you, study that. You really got the key. Non-destructive compression. Because you take all the geometry, all the geometric information down through compression into acceleration. And that's the physics, actually, of how the collective mind, the communion of saints, which would be called mitogenic radiation, how it happens. So it's very useful. And you see how this is, what I'm talking about is actually old news. It was called the caduceus. In modern physics, that's called phase conjugation or perfect damping. It's based on golden mean ratio specifically, and Hermes called it the caduceus. So you kind of see that really, this isn't new. It's actually the secret of life. Uncle Hermes did have that right. So, let's review where we are in our science class this evening. I have just hinted to you at why that one pattern for waves, pine cones kissing into a dodeca, is the cause of gravity and the cause of life, how life force gets voltage. I've shown you a little bit of how that's the cause of perception, golden ratio and brainwaves. In fact, there's another neuroscientist, Steve Lehar, who says perception is caused by phase conjugation. He agrees with me, yeah? And I've shown you how that is the origin of enlightenment, actually, the bliss moment, golden ratio, and brainwaves, okay? Now, we're not going to go into the origin of alphabet and symbol tonight. A lot of you know my work in that regard. We have origin of alphabet and origin of color on that list, just to show you briefly. So if you take that golden spiral on that donut, here's the golden spiral on that donut, and you just look at it from the shadows of the 7 arrows of the tetra. I'm just changing your point of view on that golden spiral on that donut. And you see Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, okay? So that's the origin of alphabet, you see? So alphabet was about seeing how plasma could converge to compress. If you can compress the electric fields in the right symmetry sequence, then you can cause electric fields to compress inside your head, and you have the physics of psychokinesis. How the rabbi makes a golem, why John McGovern can interpret every petroglyph on planet Earth that any shaman ever painted, because he was painting the phosphine flare, the plasma residue of what he saw inside the liquid crystal of his brain. He was seeing a compression algorithm. So this is just a hint of the physics of alphabet, that in fact this symmetry of how tetrahedron stores electric fields is the only index to which DNA can absorb charge. So obviously that's the origin of the alphabet, because the only form in which biologic memory can be stored. So you can read about that and see more of the animations on the website goldenmean.info/DNA ring. If you want your dreams to come true, dream in the language of light, which is the elements of symmetry of electric fields. Yeah? Another way to see that is if you were to hang this properly in a tetrahedron under a tree and let the children spin it slowly, they would see the origin of the alphabet on the ground, and then their dreams would come true. Do you see the physics? That's the only way children should learn alphabets. There should be no other way, truly. So finally, before we conclude this section, I did promise you to explain briefly why this is the physics of the reason color. I mean, rainbows exist. We've learned recently, Professor Korotkov learned to measure fractality in air, because he went to where the Kogis were speaking to their ancestors, measured the air, and sure enough it was fractal, which just means charge distribution, which is obviously how you make phone calls to ancestors. Anyway, and fractality in air is basically charge distribution efficiency. In the same way, in water, you know if there's life or death by measuring redox, which is charge distribution efficiency, which is fractality in water. So air can be fractal too, which is really sacred space defined. At any rate, so to understand how that works a little bit, just a little clue about fusion theory and color, which will be an introduction to part 2 of this evening, which is the colorful history and psychology of alchemy. That's part 2 of this evening's conversation. But in introduction to that, the end of part 1 is the physics of color. Okay? So I have said to you that this one wave shape, pine cones kissing, is the reason color life, gravity, perception, and bliss exist. I'm now going to explain to you the physics of why this is the only reason that color exists, if I may. And I'm going to do that in about 3 minutes flat, something that Goethe missed. So basically, if you take the physics, first of all, you need to know that color is perceived in the cone of your eye, never in the rod. In physics, we know that you can only use a cone to measure one thing. Cones are used to measure the phase angle or tilt of the incoming field, electric field, radio wave. So if you build a cone in physics, the only purpose of using a cone as an antenna is you want to know the tilt or angle of the approaching donut electric field. So that in itself is proof that obviously color is a name for the angle of the incoming photon. The other thing we know about photons is, contrary to what your physics teacher may have taught you, the photon is not a flat wave on flatland. The photon is a three-dimensional wave shape. And we obviously know in physics that all three-dimensional wave shapes are only donuts. It's the only shape that physics ever has seen any wave form. It's the only self-organizing shape for waves. So a photon's a donut. It's clear. So the donut called the photon is arriving at the cone of the eye, and the cone of the eye needs to measure the angle of the incoming donut. There's the donut. Here is, the other thing we notice is that the visible spectrum is almost precisely, or is precisely, 1 octave, 350 to 700 nanometers. And there's other fascinating thing. Well, first of all, so you would know that practically speaking, that the visible spectrum from red to green to ultraviolet and infrared is 180-degree tilt of that donut. It's a bit self-evident since you have an octave here. But the other thing that's fascinating and beautiful, is that if you take the exact frequencies of the primary colors precisely and convert that to that angular measure, 0 to 180 degrees tilt, it turns out that the colors of that we call the primary colors are precisely 0, 45, 90, 135, 180. Cube, simple, easy. Okay, that was fine. But we got 2 other angles in there. The yellow and the blue, which are really rather beautiful colors, I think. The angle, which is precisely linear, predicted by those wavelengths, is 63 and 117 degrees. Where'd that come from? Do you recognize 63 and 117 degrees? Well, I did. When I first saw this chart, I recognized those angles. You know what they are? This is 117 degrees from here to here in my hand, and this is 63 degrees right there. So the face angle of a dodecahedron is 63 and 117 degrees. What did we just learn? Wasn't that cool? What are those donuts doing when they're making rainbows? Oh my God, is that exciting or what? The donuts are angling themselves to get into the line of the faces of a dodecahedron, and when they do, they sort themselves at the center, called phase conjugation, and the result of the emerging donuts at only the angles that fit is called the rainbow. Any questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Where does this science come from about donuts and photons and angles associated with it?
Well, the only self-organizing form that waves take, for example, smoke rings, is donuts. So if you have waves, the only form they make is donuts. If a photon is a wave, it's a donut. Any questions?
So you're asserting this. It's not coming from any known source.
I don't think Einstein had any references when he published relativity.
Okay, that's my question.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Applicable to the other aspects or the other frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum, like sound?
Yes, yes. Oh, it's so beautiful. I didn't even finish the thought. So after I did my equation for the radii of hydrogen, I took the Planck time constant and the golden ratio function and did an equation, and I predicted the frequencies of hydrogen. And that same frequency cascade, which is, by the way, the secret commercial physics that we're playing with here in Melbourne, but the same equation for the frequencies, if you just keep going, it predicted the key frequencies in the audio for hydrogen. It predicted the key frequency in the megahertz for microtubules. And then, you kept going, it predicted exactly the duration of the Earth year. And it predicted exactly the duration of the Venus year. It is proof, Planck time, golden ratio, etc., that whole... It is proof that fractality in time as well as space is the only way to emerge from chaos. It is the only physics of coincidence. You want miracles in your life? Get fractal or get dead. Literally, it's about compression in time. So that article is goldenmean.info/coincidences. Millions of coincidence, singular, and millions of people have read the article, and it goes on in detail and talks about the origin of the Mayan calendar and shows the golden ratio cascade there as well, in time. The point is that time, like mass, is only a name for rotating charge. I repeat, time, like mass, is only a name for rotating charge. The inertia of the rotating charge is called mass, and the period of the rotating charge is called time. It's the same stuff. So when people say the time-space continuum, they're confusing you. It's only charge that's rotating. Time is not separate from space. And the term dimension only refers to the superposed axes of symmetry possible. And you can never superpose more than 3 without golden ratio, which is why that's the key to the 4th dimension, the hypercube. And that's where we're going to start part 2 about alchemy. But first, any more questions? Yes, sir.
You said before about surviving through compression. How do we compress?
So what were the last words you spoke?
How do we compress?
Yes. Well, thank you for asking the beautiful leading question. Okay, now I get to show my slides about death. Well, here's what we know.
Suggestion of the story of Vincent with this Tibetan lama who was going to go for to die, was shrinking.
Very good point. There's a tradition called, I believe, red lion or green lion among the Tibetans. And in fact, as they retreat and choose to die, their body compresses. And you see just fingernails and teeth left sometimes. And at the moment of death, you see rainbows. And it's even in the films. And the reason you see the rainbow is they've added a phase conjugate dielectric field to their environment at the moment of death, actually. But thank you, Valerie. But I was going to show maybe a simpler example, which is Karatkov's study of death. And this is an answer to your question, how do we compress? Because death is a pretty good example, in my view. We know that if you measure where your aura or plasma goes at death using the medical documented technique of the GDV, that your aura tends to leave your body at 10 hours and 36 hours after death, which is in some ways confirming the Tibetan literature. This is by measurement. A large number of people who were not volunteers because they were dead were measured. And in fact, the time it took for their plasma to leave after they died was consistent. By the way, it only works really well if you have a peaceful death. Very important, actually, if I may suggest. And where you need to die is a fractal. The altar at Machu Picchu will work. A hospital will not. Sorry. Because the electrosmog prevents the distribution of your plasma. A bad place to join your ancestors, actually. So you see the compression event here. This is thanks to Alex Gray. The compression is your plasma trying to find the center of a fractal. Compression, how do we compress? So an example of understanding the mechanics is called the map for when you die. The Heinrich Clouvet form constants. He interviewed a large number of people who died and then came back But I believe some of his subjects also had done too much LSD. I'm not sure of the details. But at any rate, it was a large population of people who had near-death experiences. And indeed, they reported the shape of what they saw. Indeed, they saw lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, and then it would repeat. So the geometry of death is documented. It's clear. When you're driving to Paris, get a map. If you're dying, get a map. Very simple. So the reason that's what you see when you die is because that's the folding sequence of your DNA preparing you for compression. If you can withstand compression, you can be accelerated. And the plasma, the charge of your aura, is then distributable. And that then becomes the large-scale electric field in the plasma. Your ancestors' voices. That's why the Hopi were clear. They didn't want metal sewage pipes in their burial ground, because the ancestors would stop singing. It's actually good physics. Yeah. So compression is the key to acceleration and distribution, and that's how life is formed. So this is your DNA saying lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, and the braiding algorithm. We don't have time tonight for the braiding algorithm of DNA, but basically what happens in DNA, this is called the hat of Osiris, which is the shape of the pericardium preparing you for compression. And there's a whole story about that, but too many lectures to fit in a short time. But the braiding algorithm of DNA is very relevant, just that what you see is that DNA recursively braids thread to string to rope to fat rope. There's the thread, the double helix. And that braiding algorithm, where the short wave becomes embedded in a longer and longer wave, it's called a braiding algorithm. Here's the animation of that. Here's the thread, here's the string, here's the rope, here's the fat rope. This is called embedding or nesting, where a short wave gets in phase with a longer wave. Well, when that happens recursively 7 times, the plot thickens. I mean, DNA gets thicker. And what happens is you get a soul. I mean, the DNA pilastrates and turns inside out and becomes toroidal on a large scale, and there's a phase relationship with a very long wave. And eventually your DNA becomes a little electric tornado that makes little black holes, as Peter Garrieff was measured. So it's actually this recursive braiding in DNA, which is this phase discipline to a very long wave, which enables you to become psychokinetic. The sort of playful way to understand this story is, if your ancestors walked barefoot on the same land for 100 generations, there is so much phase discipline between their DNA braid sequence and the magnetism of that land that their emotions fabricate the weather. Very long waves. It's another name for weather. Charge, you see? So when Auntie Lorraine died there in Byron, and the storm went right across the continent on the magnetic line, you know? And that's another story. Any other questions?
Do you want to call it a break at this point?
Yes, good idea. So after the break, the idea is to do a romantic story about love and alchemy and John Dee and yes. Okay, so juicy. Thank you very much.